The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wooden platform of Millstone Creek Station as the locomotive hissed to a final stop. Catherine Okonkwo pressed her gloved hand against the train window, her heart hammering beneath the carefully pressed traveling dress she had sewn herself over 3 sleepless nights. Through the smudged glass, she could see him. Thomas Whitmore stood exactly where he had promised in his letters. Beside the station house, a bouquet clutched in his weathered hands. But even from this distance, Catherine could read the story written across his face as their eyes met for the first time. It was not the story either of them had imagined. The conductor's voice broke through her paralysis. "Millstone Creek, miss. End of the line." Catherine rose on trembling legs, smoothing her skirts with hands that had known both the refinement of her father's library in Lagos and the roughness of factory work in Philadelphia. She had crossed an ocean and half a continent to reach this moment. There was no turning back now, even as every instinct screamed that she should. The platform felt unsteady beneath her feet as she descended, or perhaps it was her own legs betraying her courage. Thomas Whitmore had not moved. He stood frozen, the bouquet drooping toward the worn planks, his face cycling through expressions that Catherine had learned to recognize in her 26 years. Shock, confusion, and finally, the careful rearrangement of features into something meant to pass for politeness but fooling no one. "Miss Okonkwo," his voice was hoarse, as though her name had gotten stuck somewhere between his thoughts and his tongue. "You are Miss Catherine Okonkwo?" "I am." Catherine lifted her chin, a gesture her father had taught her long ago. "When the world tries to make you small," her father had said, "you must grow taller in your spirit. Though I suspect that is no longer the answer you were hoping for." Thomas's face flushed deep red, the color spreading from his collar to his hairline. Around them, the daily commerce of the station had slowed to a crawl. The ticketmaster had stopped mid-count of his receipts. 2 women loading a wagon full of dry goods had paused, their hands suspended over barrels of flour. Even the station dog had lifted its head to observe this unusual tableau. "In your letters," Thomas began, then stopped. He tried again. "You wrote so beautifully about literature and music, about teaching children and tending gardens. You never mentioned that you were colored. You never asked." Catherine's voice remained steady, though her insides twisted like wrung cloth. "In 18 letters. Mr. Whitmore, you asked about my thoughts on Tennyson's poetry. You asked about my views on education. You asked if I could bake bread and mend shirts. But you never once asked what I looked like. I assumed, perhaps foolishly, that such things did not matter to a man who claimed to value the content of a person's character above all else." Thomas flinched as his own written words were reflected back at him. "But surely you understood that I expected someone more suitable. Someone who could fit into a community like Millstone Creek. Someone white." Catherine supplied the words he could not quite bring himself to say. "Someone whose presence would not challenge the comfortable assumptions of your neighbors." The ticketmaster coughed loudly, drawing their attention. He was an older man with kind eyes that had seen too much of the world to be surprised by human weakness. "Begging your pardon, but this platform isn't the place for lengthy discussions. Miss, do you have somewhere to go? Family in town?" Catherine felt the last remnants of her hope crumble into dust. "No. I spent my savings on the journey here. I was led to believe I had a home waiting." Thomas reached into his pocket with shaking hands. "I can provide funds for lodging. The boarding house on Main Street. It's clean and respectable. We can discuss arrangements, perhaps send you back to Philadelphia with enough money to start fresh." The bills he offered were crisp and new, and Catherine saw them for exactly what they were. The price of Thomas Whitmore's guilty conscience. The cost of making an inconvenient problem disappear without having to face the ugliness of his own prejudice. "I see." Catherine's voice could have frozen the late summer air. "And tell me, Mr. Whitmore, what is the going rate for a woman's dignity these days? How many dollars does it take to erase 6 months of letters? To compensate for 3 weeks of travel? To pay for the embarrassment of being rejected like spoiled goods on a train platform? Now see here." Thomas's voice rose defensively. I'm trying to do the right thing. You can't expect me to go through with this arrangement when you deliberately misled me. The only person who was misled here was me. Catherine's composure finally cracked, not into tears, but into a cold fury that made Thomas step back. I was misled into believing I had found a man of genuine character, a man whose beautiful words on paper reflected an equally beautiful soul. Instead, I find a coward who cannot see past the color of skin to the person underneath. A new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Thomas Whitmore, I had always suspected you were a fool. Today you have provided definitive proof. Catherine turned to find herself looking at a man who seemed carved from granite and patience. He was perhaps in his mid-40s, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that assessed everything with the calm calculation of someone who missed very little. His clothes were simple, work-worn denim and a cotton shirt, but his bearing suggested someone accustomed to command. Mr. Garrett. Thomas's voice held equal parts resentment and something that might have been fear. This is a private matter. Not anymore. The man called Garrett moved closer, his attention fixing on Catherine with an intensity that made her want to stand even straighter. James Garrett, miss. I own the mill and most of the timberland around Millstone Creek. I couldn't help but overhear your predicament. Catherine managed a small nod. Catherine Okonkwo, recently of Philadelphia, and apparently soon to be departing Millstone Creek. That would be unfortunate. James Garrett's words were measured, but there was something in his tone that suggested he rarely said things he did not mean. You mentioned teaching children. We are in desperate need of a qualified teacher. Our last schoolmaster took a position in Denver 3 months ago, and the children have been running wild ever since. Thomas made a strangled sound of protest. You cannot be serious, Garrett. The school board would never approve. The parents would withdraw their children. James turned to Thomas with a look that could have withered crops. The school board consists of myself, Reverend Matthews, and Dr. Sullivan. I believe I can secure the necessary votes. As for the parents, they are welcome to teach their own children if they find my hiring decisions objectionable, although I suspect most will realize that an educated teacher from Philadelphia is worth far more than their petty prejudices. She's a colored woman, Thomas's voice cracked with frustration. You'll make yourself a laughingstock. You'll make the whole town a laughingstock. Then let us laugh together. James Garrett's smile was thin and sharp. I have found that those who worry most about being laughed at usually have the least substantial things to offer the world. Miss Okonkwo, do you have teaching credentials? Catherine's mind reeled from the swift turn of events. I graduated from the Philadelphia Institute for Colored Youth. I taught for 4 years at a school for freedmen's children before the funding was cut. I have my certificates and letters of recommendation in my trunk. Excellent. The position pays $40 per month, plus room and board in the schoolhouse quarters. Classes begin in 2 weeks. Will that be sufficient time for you to prepare? Catherine searched James Garrett's face for some sign of mockery or ulterior motive. She found only a patient waiting, as though he had asked her opinion on the weather and was content to hear her answer in her own time. More than sufficient. But Mr. Garrett, I must ask why you would take such a risk for a stranger. James was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with memory. My wife, Eleanor, passed away 4 years ago from consumption. In her final weeks, she made me promise something. She said that whenever I had the power to act justly, I should do so without hesitation, regardless of the cost to my comfort or reputation. I have found it to be excellent advice, even when following it proves inconvenient. He turned back to Thomas, who had gone pale and silent. Thomas, I believe you have some items belonging to Miss Okonkwo. Her trunk, perhaps? Thomas gestured weakly toward a porter who had been watching the entire scene with wide eyes. The young man hurried to retrieve Catherine's trunk, the single battered case that contained everything she owned in the world. As the porter loaded it onto James Garrett's wagon, Catherine felt the curious stares of every person at the station. She could already hear the whispers that would spread through Millstone Creek like wildfire. The colored woman who came as a mail-order bride and stayed to teach their children. Some would be scandalized. Others would be outraged. A few, perhaps, would be curious. James offered his hand to help her into the wagon, and Catherine took it, feeling the calluses earned by honest work. "I should warn you," she said quietly as they prepared to leave. "I am not accustomed to being anyone's charity case. I will earn my position through my work, or I will not stay. I would expect nothing less." James clicked to the horses, and the wagon began to roll forward. "And Miss Okonkwo? What Thomas Whitmore failed to see in you is his loss entirely. I have a feeling that Millstone Creek is about to receive an education in more ways than one." As they pulled away from the station, Catherine allowed herself one last glance at Thomas Whitmore, still standing on the platform with his wilted bouquet and his comfortable prejudices. He looked smaller, somehow, diminished by his own limitations. Catherine turned forward, toward the unknown streets of Millstone Creek and the uncertain future waiting there. Behind her, she left the woman who had traveled across oceans and continents seeking acceptance. Ahead of her, she would discover who she could become when she stopped asking for permission to exist and simply began to live with purpose. The schoolhouse, when they reached it 20 minutes later, was a modest white building with a bell tower and windows that needed washing. The attached teachers' quarters were small but clean, with a bed, a desk, and a stove that looked like it might actually heat the room in winter. "It's not much," James said, carrying her trunk inside with ease. "But it's yours for as long as you choose to stay." Catherine ran her hand along the desk, feeling the grooves worn by previous teachers. "It's more than I had an hour ago. That makes it a palace." James paused at the doorway, his expression thoughtful. "Thomas Whitmore is not an evil man, Miss Okonkwo, but he is a weak one. He will not be the last in Millstone Creek to test your resolve. Some will do so with deliberate cruelty. Others will simply be frightened of what you represent. A change they did not ask for and are not prepared to accept." "And you, Mr. Garrett?" Catherine met his eyes directly. "Are you prepared to accept this change you have set in motion?" James Garrett smiled, and for the first time, it reached his eyes. "I am prepared to see what happens when we stop letting fear make our decisions for us. The rest, I suppose, we will discover together." After he left, Catherine stood at the window of her new home, watching the sun set over Millstone Creek. She thought of her father in Lagos, dead now these 10 years, and what he might say if he could see her here. She thought of the children in Philadelphia, whose education had been cut short by politics and funding. She thought of Thomas Whitmore and his beautiful letters, filled with beautiful lies. But mostly, she thought about tomorrow, about the children who would walk through the schoolhouse door in 2 weeks, about the town that would judge her before they knew her, about James Garrett and his quiet conviction that justice mattered more than comfort. Catherine Okonkwo unpacked her trunk as darkness fell, arranging her few possessions with careful deliberation. Her teaching certificates went on the wall. Her father's watch sat on the desk. Her mother's Bible found a place beside the bed. And hidden in the false bottom of her trunk, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked between layers of pressed flowers, remained the real reason she had come to Millstone Creek. Not for Thomas Whitmore, not for love, but for something far more important, something that would, in time, change everything. The morning of Catherine's first day as Millstone Creek's teacher began with a rock through the schoolhouse window. She found it at dawn, surrounded by shattered glass that glittered like malicious stars across the wooden floor. Wrapped around the rock was a note written in crude letters, "Go back where you came from." Catherine swept up the glass with methodical care, her hands steady despite the racing of her heart. She had expected resistance. What surprised her was how quickly it had arrived. She had been in Millstone Creek for exactly 9 days, and already someone hated her enough to throw rocks in the darkness. By the time the first children arrived, Catherine had replaced the broken window with oiled paper, rearranged the desks, and written the day's lesson on the freshly scrubbed blackboard. She stood at the door as families approached, watching parents assess her with barely concealed hostility while their children stared with the unfiltered curiosity of youth. "Good morning." Catherine greeted each family with perfect politeness. "I'm Miss Okonkwo, your new teacher. I look forward to working with your children this year." Most parents offered stiff nods and hurried away. A few made their opinions clear through deliberate silence. But 3 families turned around entirely, pulling their confused children back toward the road. "Papa, why can't I go to school?" A little girl's voice carried back to Catherine. "You said I had to learn my letters." "Not from her," the father replied, loud enough to ensure Catherine heard. "We'll make other arrangements." By the time the school bell rang, Catherine had 11 students instead of the expected 30. 11 children whose parents were either brave enough or desperate enough to value education over prejudice. She looked at their faces, ranging from 6 years old to 14, and saw her own nerves reflected back at her. "Well then," Catherine said, closing the door gently. "Shall we begin?" What she had not anticipated was that the children themselves would not be the problem. Young Thomas Sullivan was the doctor's son, well-mannered and eager to please. The Kowalski twins spoke more Polish than English, but possessed sharp minds and sharper wit. Little Emma Garrett, James's 7-year-old niece, had her uncle's serious eyes and his determination to see the best in people. The problem arrived 3 hours into the first day when Silas Porter, the blacksmith, appeared at the schoolhouse door with fury written across his soot-stained face. Catherine saw him through the window and felt her stomach drop, but she finished the grammar lesson before stepping outside to meet him. "Mr. Porter, how may I help you?" "You can leave." Silas Porter was a mountain of a man, all muscle and rage. "My boy Luke should be in that schoolhouse, learning proper lessons from a proper teacher." Catherine held her ground, though she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Your son is welcome in my classroom whenever you change your mind. Every child in Millstone Creek is welcome. I turn no one away. You don't understand." Silas leaned closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "This town has ways of dealing with troublemakers, ways of making people understand when they're not wanted." "Is that what the rock through my window was meant to communicate?" Catherine kept her voice level. "Because I received that message quite clearly, Mr. Porter. What I choose to do with it, however, is my own decision." Silas's face purpled with rage. "You think you're better than us? You think because Garrett gave you this job that you belong here?" "I think," Catherine said quietly, "that you are frightened. You are frightened that I might teach your son, as well as any white teacher. You are frightened that he might learn to see past the color of skin to the person underneath. And most of all, you are frightened that in doing so, he might judge you and find you wanting as a father." The words hit Silas Porter like physical blows. For a moment, Catherine thought he might strike her. Instead, he turned and stormed away, his footsteps shaking the ground. When Catherine returned to the classroom, she found 11 pairs of eyes watching her with new expressions. Not fear, something else. Something that looked almost like respect. Young Thomas raised his hand tentatively. "Miss Okonkwo, my papa says you're the bravest person he's ever met. Is that true?" Catherine smiled sadly. "Bravery is not the absence of fear, Thomas. It is doing what must be done despite being afraid. Now, who can tell me what we learned this morning about proper sentence structure?" The days that followed established a pattern. Catherine taught with a dedication that bordered on obsession, determined to prove that her students would not suffer for having her as their teacher. She arrived before dawn and stayed long after the children left, preparing lessons and grading papers by lamplight. Her students thrived under her attention, their reading improving and their curiosity awakening. But outside the schoolhouse, Millstone Creek's resistance grew more organized. Merchants forgot to serve her. The boarding house refused to provide her meals, forcing her to cook all her food in the schoolhouse quarters. Whispers followed her every journey down Main Street, and more than once she found the word N scrawled on the schoolhouse steps. Each morning, Catherine scrubbed away the slurs and continued teaching. Each evening, she wrote detailed lessons for the next day, refusing to give her critics any ammunition to use against her competence. James Garrett visited every few days, checking on her progress and offering quiet support. He never asked if she was considering leaving. Perhaps he knew she was too stubborn to abandon her students, no matter how difficult the town made her life. The school board meets next week, James mentioned during one visit. There will be a vote on whether to retain you past the initial trial period. Reverend Matthews is firmly in your corner. Sullivan has been impressed by his son's progress. I believe we have the votes. And if you don't? Catherine asked, though she already knew the answer. Then we will find another way. James's jaw set with determination. I made a promise to Eleanor. I do not break my promises. The school board meeting, held in the church basement, drew a crowd that spilled out into the street. Catherine arrived early, wearing her best dress and carrying a folder of her students' work. She sat in the front row, back straight, chin up, and waited for judgment to be pronounced. Silas Porter spoke first, his voice booming through the small space. This woman has no business teaching our children. She's filling their heads with ideas above their station, teaching them to question their parents and disrespect tradition. My son's reading has improved dramatically, Dr. Sullivan countered. He's learning Latin and mathematics. His penmanship is exceptional. Whatever ideas Miss Okonkwo is filling his head with seem to be remarkably educational. It's not natural, one of the mothers called out. Having a colored woman in a position of authority. What message does that send to our children? Reverend Matthews stood slowly, his elderly frame still commanding presence. The message it sends, Mrs. Henderson, is that knowledge has no color, that competence should be judged by results, not by prejudice. I have visited Miss Okonkwo's classroom. I have seen her students' work, and I have seen something else. I have seen children learning to think critically, to question thoughtfully, and to engage with the world through the power of education. If that is not the purpose of a teacher, then I confess I have misunderstood my own calling. The debate raged for 2 hours. Catherine sat through it all, listening to strangers dissect her worth, her competence, her very right to exist in their community. She heard herself called incompetent, dangerous, and worse. She also heard unexpected voices rise in her defense. Parents whose children had blossomed under her teaching. Merchants who had seen her dedication. Even a few who admitted they had been wrong to judge her before knowing her. Finally, James Garrett called for the vote. All those in favor of retaining Miss Catherine Okonkwo as Millstone Creek's teacher, 3 hands rose. James, Dr. Sullivan, and Reverend Matthews. The narrow margin of victory, but a victory nonetheless. Silas Porter stood abruptly, his chair clattering behind him. This isn't over, Garrett. You're making an enemy of every decent family in this town. If decency requires me to deny a gifted teacher her position based solely on the color of her skin, James replied calmly, then I prefer to stand with the indecent. Miss Okonkwo will continue teaching, and any parent who chooses to keep their child home is robbing that child of an excellent education. That is their choice to make. As the crowd dispersed, muttering and angry, Catherine remained seated. She felt simultaneously victorious and exhausted, relieved and terrified. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. James approached her quietly. You should know. This will get harder before it gets easier. They will look for any excuse to remove you. Any mistake, any perceived impropriety. I understand. Catherine gathered her folder of student work. Mr. Garrett, I need to tell you something about why I really came to Millstone Creek. James's expression remained neutral. I wondered when you might trust me with that truth. You knew I had ulterior motives? Miss Okonkwo, women of your education and capability do not typically respond to mail-order bride advertisements in small frontier towns. I assumed you had reasons beyond love. I simply chose to respect your privacy until you were ready to share them. Catherine pulled a carefully folded document from her folder. My grandfather was a railroad surveyor. Before he died, he worked on the proposed route for the Transcontinental Western Railroad. He discovered that the most efficient path runs directly through Millstone Creek, through land currently owned by various families who have no idea of its future value. James studied the document, his expression unreadable. And you came here too? to purchase options on that land before the railroad announces its route. Thomas Whitmore's property sits directly in the path. So does Silas Porter's smithy. So do the lands of every family that has worked hardest to drive me away. Catherine met James's eyes directly. I came here planning to make my fortune off the people who would reject me, to use their prejudice against them by buying land they think is worthless and selling it back to them at premium prices when they discover their mistake. That would be poetic justice. James handed back the document. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm no longer sure I want that kind of justice. Catherine's voice wavered slightly. My students deserve better than a teacher who is using them as cover for land speculation. This town, for all its flaws, deserves better than manipulation. And I think perhaps I deserve better than to become the very thing I despise. James was quiet for a long time, his gaze distant and thoughtful. Finally, he spoke. Eleanor used to say that the measure of a person's character is not whether they make mistakes, but whether they have the courage to change course when they realize they've chosen the wrong path. What will you do with your grandfather's information? Catherine folded the document carefully. I think I will teach. Just teach. And perhaps, in time, when the railroad does come, I will use what I know to help families negotiate fair prices rather than exploiting their ignorance. Is that foolishly naive? It is courageously principled, James corrected. And it is exactly the kind of character this town needs to see. Miss Okonkwo, would you do me the honor of joining me for dinner tomorrow evening? I think we should discuss how best to prepare Millstone Creek for the changes ahead, together. Catherine felt warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she had almost forgotten was possible. I would like that very much, Mr. Garrett. As she walked back to the schoolhouse, under a canopy of stars, Catherine thought about the woman she had been when she arrived in Millstone Creek. Angry, hurt, bent on a revenge that would have poisoned her as surely as it hurt her targets. Thomas Whitmore's rejection, meant to diminish her, had instead set her on a path towards something she had never expected to find. A purpose that transcended profit, a community that needed her, even if they didn't know it yet. And perhaps, just perhaps, the beginning of something that felt remarkably like home. Tomorrow, she would face her classroom again. She would teach children to read and write and think. She would endure the stares and whispers of a town still learning to see past its own limitations. But tonight, for the first time since that humiliating afternoon at the train station, Catherine Okonkwo allowed herself to hope. Winter arrived in Millstone Creek with a fury that matched the town's earlier hostility toward Catherine. Snow piled high against the schoolhouse walls, and the oiled paper in the broken window rattled with each gust of wind. James Garrett had offered repeatedly to replace it with proper glass, but Catherine had declined. She wanted to remember. Every morning, she looked at that paper and reminded herself that she had not run. She had not broken. She had simply continued. By December, her classroom had grown to 23 students. Parents who had withdrawn their children in protest found themselves struggling to teach their own lessons while also managing farms and businesses. One by one, they swallowed their pride and sent their children back. Some offered apologies. Others simply avoided Catherine's eyes during morning drop-off. She accepted both with equal grace. The town's resistance had not disappeared, but it had evolved. The overt hostility had faded into something more subtle. Grudging respect from some, lingering suspicion from others, and from a surprising handful, genuine friendship. Young Thomas Sullivan's mother had begun leaving fresh bread on the schoolhouse steps each Monday. The Kowalski family invited her to their Christmas celebration, where she learned to dance polkas and ate pierogi until she thought she might burst. And then there was James Garrett. Their weekly dinners had become a ritual that the town watched with intense interest. James was Millstone Creek's most eligible widower, and Catherine was still the scandalous newcomer. Their relationship provided endless fodder for gossip, speculation, and disapproval. People are talking, Catherine mentioned during one dinner at James's home, a comfortable farmhouse on the edge of town. People always talk. James poured more coffee into her cup. The question is whether we care about what they're saying. I care that it might affect your business. That families might stop buying from your mill out of protest. James laughed. a warm sound that Catherine had learned to cherish. Catherine, I own the only mill within 50 miles. They can be as offended as they like. They will still need lumber. Besides, profits are not worth sacrificing principles. It was during these dinners that Catherine had told James about her life before Millstone Creek, about her parents who had died within a year of each other, about the school in Philadelphia that had been her sanctuary and prison both, about the loneliness that had driven her to answer Thomas Whitmore's advertisement, even though she knew the dangers of such correspondence. I thought I could make myself small enough to fit into his expectations, she admitted one evening. I thought if I was careful enough, respectable enough, educated enough, he might see past my skin to the person underneath. It was foolish. It was hopeful. James corrected. Hope is never foolish, even when it proves misplaced. Thomas Whitmore's failure to see your worth says everything about him and nothing about you. These conversations, held by firelight in James's comfortable sitting room, had become the foundation of something neither of them had quite named yet. Something that felt like partnership, like respect, like the possibility of love, built on honesty rather than illusion. Then came the telegram that changed everything. Catherine was in the middle of teaching fractions when the telegraph operator's son burst through the door, waving a yellow paper. Miss Okonkwo, emergency telegram. It came addressed to you, care of Mr. Garrett. Catherine's hands trembled as she took the telegram. She had received no correspondence since arriving in Millstone Creek besides a few letters from former colleagues in Philadelphia. Who would send her an emergency message? She unfolded the paper and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Railroad route announced stop Millstone Creek. Confirmed as major hub, stop land speculators. Arriving within weeks. Stop. Act quickly. Stop. Davidson. Samuel Davidson had been her grandfather's surveying partner. He was also the one who had given Catherine the route maps before she left Philadelphia. He had known all along what she was planning. What he had not known was that she had abandoned those plans entirely. Catherine's mind raced through the implications. The railroad announcement would transform Millstone Creek from a quiet farming community into a booming hub of commerce. Land values would skyrocket. Families who had lived on modest farms for generations would suddenly find themselves sitting on fortunes or targets for unscrupulous speculators who would use any tactic to purchase land cheaply before the true value became known. Miss Okonkwo? Little Emma Garrett looked up from her slate with concern. Is everything all right? Catherine forced herself to smile. Everything is fine, Emma. Let's continue with our lesson. But nothing was fine. By the time school ended, word of the telegram had spread through town. Catherine found James waiting for her at the schoolhouse, his expression grave. I think we need to talk, he gestured toward his wagon. They drove in silence to his farmhouse, where James built up the fire and poured them both generous measures of whiskey. Catherine, who rarely drank, accepted gratefully. The railroad is coming. James's words were not a question. Yes. The official announcement will be made public next week, but speculators have already received advance notice. They'll be here within days, trying to buy land before the news spreads. And you knew this would happen. That's why you really came to Millstone Creek. Catherine nodded miserably. I had the maps. I knew the route. I planned to buy options on key properties and resell them at enormous profits. I was going to make a fortune off the ignorance of people who hated me. Why didn't you? James asked quietly. Because somewhere between teaching multiplication tables and learning to dance Polish folk dances, I realized I didn't want revenge. I wanted something much harder to obtain. I wanted to belong, to build rather than destroy, to prove that Thomas Whitmore was wrong about me, not by making him suffer, but by becoming someone worthy of this community's respect. James was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. Catherine felt her heart breaking, certain that she had lost his trust, his friendship, everything they had been building together. Finally, he spoke. Catherine, I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you have feelings for me? Real feelings? Or was I always part of your plan to establish yourself here? Catherine met his eyes directly. James Garrett, from the moment you defended me at that train station, you have been the most genuine, principled, unexpectedly kind man I have ever known. What I feel for you has nothing to do with land speculation or revenge plots. It has everything to do with the fact that you see me. Not my skin color. Not my utility. Not what I represent. You see me. And that terrifies me almost as much as it fills me with hope. James reached across the space between them and took her hand. Then here is what we're going to do. We are going to call an emergency town meeting. We are going to tell everyone about the railroad, and we are going to help families protect their land from speculators before they lose everything. But the townspeople hate me. Why would they believe anything I say? Because you have spent 4 months proving your character through your actions, because your students are thriving, because even the people who wanted you gone have started to realize that you are exactly what this community needed. And because I will stand beside you and vouch for you. The town meeting 2 days later drew every resident of Millstone Creek and the surrounding farms. The church could not hold the crowd, so they gathered in the open space in front of the courthouse. Catherine stood on the steps beside James, holding the surveying maps with hands that threatened to shake but held steady through sheer will. James spoke first, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. Many of you know that I have employed Miss Catherine Okonkwo as our teacher. What you may not know is that she came to Millstone Creek with knowledge that could have made her wealthy at your expense. Instead, she is here today to share that knowledge and help protect you from those who would exploit it. Silas Porter's voice boomed from the crowd. Why should we trust anything she says? She's probably working with the speculators herself. Catherine stepped forward, unrolling the maps. Mr. Porter, the Transcontinental Western Railroad will be announcing their route next week. The main line runs directly through Millstone Creek. Your smithy sits on what will become the most valuable commercial property in 3 counties. Within days, land speculators will arrive, offering you what sounds like generous money for your land. It will not be generous. It will be a fraction of what your property is worth. She pointed to the map, showing the proposed route. The Kowalski farm will be bisected by the line, requiring right-of-way. The Henderson property will become prime residential land. The Sullivan medical practice will be positioned perfectly for the new commercial district. Dr. Sullivan pushed through the crowd, studying the map intently. How long have you known this? Since before I arrived, Catherine admitted. My grandfather helped survey this route. I came to Millstone Creek, planning to buy options on these properties before anyone realized their value. I planned to make my fortune while proving that the people who rejected me for my color were fools. The crowd erupted in angry mutters. Catherine felt James's steady presence beside her, but forced herself to continue alone. But I was the fool, she said, her voice rising above the noise. I was a fool to think that revenge would heal my wounded pride. I was a fool to believe that my anger justified manipulating good people who were simply frightened of change. Most of all, I was a fool to think that belonging could be purchased or taken. It can only be earned through trust and proven through actions. Reverend Matthews made his way to the front. Why should we believe you're telling the truth now? What's to stop you from buying these properties yourself with the information you just shared? Catherine pulled another document from her satchel. This is a signed affidavit surrendering any claim I might have to purchase property in Millstone Creek for the purpose of speculation. I have filed it with the county recorder. I cannot profit from this information, but you can protect yourselves if you work together. James took over, outlining a plan for the town to form a cooperative. By negotiating with the railroad as a unified group, they could ensure fair compensation and maintain control of their community's development. By pooling their resources, they could hire lawyers to protect their interests and surveyors to verify their property boundaries. Miss Okonkwo has provided us with detailed information about market rates, legal precedents, and negotiating strategies, James concluded. She is offering to help every family in Millstone Creek prepare for the changes ahead, asking nothing in return except what she has earned through her teaching. The question is whether we have the courage to accept help from someone we have treated so poorly. The silence that followed was profound. Then, to Catherine's amazement, Mrs. Sullivan stepped forward. "My son reads Shakespeare now," she said quietly. "He can solve mathematical equations I don't understand. He speaks respectfully to his father and me. He has become a young man I am proud of, thanks to Miss Okonkwo's teaching. If she says we need to protect our land, I believe her." One by one, others stepped forward, parents whose children had flourished, farmers who had noticed Catherine's dedication, even some who had never sent their children to her school but had observed her character from a distance. Silas Porter was the last to speak. His massive frame seemed somehow smaller as he stepped forward, hat in hand. "Miss Okonkwo, I have been cruel to you. I have said things that shame me now. My boy Luke has fallen behind the other children because of my stubbornness. I am asking, if you'll have him, to accept him in your classroom. And I am asking for your help protecting the smithy that has been in my family for 3 generations. Catherine felt tears threatening but held them back. "Luke is welcome in my classroom, Mr. Porter. He has always been welcome." The railroad's arrival 3 months later brought exactly the chaos Catherine had predicted. Speculators descended on Millstone Creek like locusts, offering quick cash for land they expected to resell at 10 times the price. But the unified front of the Millstone Creek Cooperative, armed with accurate valuations and skilled negotiators, ensured fair deals that protected families while allowing for necessary development. The schoolhouse needed expanding to accommodate the influx of new residents. Catherine found herself teaching 40 students, with 2 assistant teachers whom she trained personally. The oiled paper in the window had finally been replaced with proper glass, but Catherine kept the original paper in her desk as a reminder of how far they had all come. James Garrett proposed on a spring evening, kneeling in the schoolhouse where they had first fought for Catherine's right to stay. "I am asking you to marry me not despite who you are, but because of exactly who you are. You are brilliant, principled, courageous, and stubborn as hell. You challenge me to be better. You have transformed this entire town simply by refusing to let our limitations define your possibilities." Catherine pulled him to his feet, laughing through tears. "James Garrett, I came to this town expecting to find revenge. Instead, I found home. Yes, 1,000 times. Yes." Their wedding, held in the same church where the school board had voted on her employment, brought together a community that had learned painful lessons about prejudice, second chances, and the cost of judging people by their skin rather than their character. Thomas Whitmore sent a letter from his new home 2 states away. In it, he wrote, "I have heard of your success in Millstone Creek. I wish I could say I had known all along that you would flourish, but that would be a lie. The truth is, I was too small-minded to see what was standing right in front of me. I hope someday to become half the person you are. Thank you for proving me wrong." Catherine read the letter once, then filed it away. She bore Thomas no ill will. His rejection had hurt deeply, but it had also freed her from the cage of trying to make herself acceptable to people who would never see past their own prejudices. On their first anniversary, James surprised Catherine with a gift. It was a brass plaque for the schoolhouse, engraved with words he had written himself. "The Catherine Okonkwo School of Millstone Creek, where we learn that education enlightens not just minds, but hearts, and that the greatest lessons often come from the teachers we almost rejected." As Catherine stood before her students on a bright autumn morning, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. The pain of rejection, the temptation of revenge, the slow, difficult work of choosing grace over bitterness, the unexpected blessing of being seen and valued for exactly who she was. "Today," she told her students, representing every color and background the railroad had brought to their growing town, "we are going to talk about resilience, about what it means to face adversity and choose not to let it destroy your spirit, about the difference between justice and revenge, about how the people who reject you often teach you the most about your own strength." Little Luke Porter raised his hand. "Is this going to be another lesson about your life, Miss Catherine?" Catherine smiled, using the familiar name her students had adopted. Perhaps. But it's also a lesson about your lives. Because each of you will face moments when the world tries to tell you that you don't belong, that you're too different, too unexpected, too much of whatever makes you uniquely you. And in those moments, you will have to decide whether to believe those voices or to prove them wrong by simply being magnificent. As the lesson continued, Catherine glanced out the window to see James crossing the schoolyard, coming to walk her home for lunch, as he did every day. She saw the town stretching beyond, transformed from a place that had rejected her into a community that had grown by accepting her. She had come to Millstone Creek as a rejected mail-order bride, carrying anger and plans for revenge. She had stayed as a teacher, then a wife, then a pillar of a community that had learned to see past its own limitations. Thomas Whitmore had been right about one thing. The woman who answered his letters had been unsuitable for his small, prejudiced life. But she had been perfect for something much bigger. A life of purpose. A community that needed challenging. A man who valued character over comfort. And as Catherine turned back to her students, she realized that the greatest revenge she could have ever imagined was this. Not making her rejectors suffer, but building something so beautiful, so meaningful, and so enduring that their rejection became completely irrelevant. She had not changed Millstone Creek by forcing it to accept her. She had transformed it by showing, every single day, what it meant to live with dignity, courage, and an unwavering commitment to justice. And in doing so, she had taught the town's greatest lesson, that the people we almost reject are often exactly the ones we need most. That prejudice makes us smaller, while opening our hearts makes us infinite. That belonging is not about fitting into someone else's narrow expectations, but about having the courage to be magnificently, undeniably, courageously yourself. The end.